Some men don't preach, they carry their faith in silence. Harrison Ford never tried to explain what he believed. But one night, under the glare of live television, a single question pushed him to the edge of something deeper. And in 10 seconds of darkness, the world saw a kind of stillness it couldn't forget. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The audience burst into laughter beneath the burning studio lights, the kind that made everything feel like a show even when it was. Camera cranes hovered overhead, stage hands scattered like ghosts in black. It was a live taping, and the air was electric with the kind of anticipation people only feel when they expect blood. At center stage, a host known as much for her political bite as her comedic timing straightened the stack of cards in her hands. Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her glasses, leaned into the camera, and delivered the line she had clearly been holding back for the perfect moment. "So Harrison," she grinned, "after all these years of flying planes and running from boulders, you really believe someone up there is watching over you in the cockpit?" The audience exploded, not a nervous chuckle, a roar. Someone clapped from the second row as if this was a comedy roast and not a nationally syndicated interview. Whoopi held her expression just long enough to make sure the laugh landed. Then she gestured toward the side stage. "Please welcome the man, the myth, the adventurer in every timeline, Harrison Ford." The applause was deafening, but Ford's entrance was quiet. No swagger, no wink to the crowd. Just steady footsteps, dark jeans, worn boots, and a navy blue shirt with sleeves rolled just enough to show time didn't scare him. He offered a small wave, more of a courtesy than a performance, and crossed to his seat like someone used to walking into uncomfortable rooms. The applause faded, not out of disinterest, but confusion. The man on stage didn't seem like someone who needed to be here. He looked like he had something better to do, like fly a seaplane or fix a fence. Whoopi leaned in, still smiling, still holding control. "You know this is live, right?" she asked. "We don't do prayer here." The audience laughed again, shorter this time, sharper. Ford didn't react. He sat, spine straight, one hand resting casually on his leg, the other lifted, almost imperceptibly, to touch the small silver pendant hanging from a chain around his neck. A miniature airplane, not flashy, not new. Just worn like it had been with him through storms. He didn't clutch it, didn't show it off, just touched it like someone checking if a compass still pointed north. Whoopi's smile widened. "I mean, you've faced snakes, Nazis, Sith Lords, but you still believe in something as soft as faith?" Silence. Ford's eyes didn't narrow, his shoulders didn't shift. If anything, he looked like a man who had heard this question before, not from a host, but from life itself. The camera zoomed in. The studio lights dimmed a touch. Whether by design or discomfort, the atmosphere shifted. Slightly, quietly, then Ford spoke. "Not everyone who believes in something is looking for a happy ending." The words landed like a whisper in a canyon, soft, but they echoed. The audience didn't laugh, not this time. They waited for the punchline, for the retort, for the explanation that would let them laugh again. None came. Whoopi blinked, her lips parted. But the smile had slipped, and Harrison Ford just sat there, still, present, untouched, a pilot without turbulence, a man with nothing to sell. And somewhere between that silence and that steady breath, something shifted. And no one in that room could quite say what it was. The silence hadn't broken, not really. It stretched like a held breath, the kind that makes people shift in their seats without knowing why. Whoopi adjusted the cards in her hand again, a reflex now. Her smile returned, but not quite with the same ease. "All right," she said, leaning forward as if nudging the moment back into something safe. "So let's talk about that plane crash. You go down in a vintage aircraft, hit the ground hard, get dragged out of the wreckage, and after all that, you still think someone was looking out for you." A few people chuckled, but most didn't. Harrison Ford didn't flinch. He didn't react to the sarcasm. He looked at her the way someone looks at a question they've already answered 100 times, just never out loud. He exhaled slow, then spoke. "I remember the dirt," he said. "Face down, couldn't move my ribs, couldn't turn my head, just dirt, wind, and this strange quiet in my ears, like the world had stepped away to see what I'd do." Whoopi blinked. The audience leaned in. "I didn't call for God," he said. "I didn't call for help. I just thought, if I get out of this, I want to do it right. I want to show up better, for someone, for anyone." The laughter that had once owned the room had vanished completely. All that remained was breath and stillness. Ford reached up again, gently brushing the small silver airplane around his neck, not as a gesture, as a memory. "They pulled me out with my legs twisted under me. My sternum was broken. I remember seeing the sky, just sky, and thinking, well, you still have another shot." Whoopi sat still, lips parted as if a follow-up was forming, but nothing came out. The studio lights, without cue or intention, seemed to soften, the edges of everything blurred, as if the set itself had decided not to intrude. The camera moved closer, not rushed, curious. And there, in the focus of millions, was not a movie star, not a legend, not the roguish adventurer everyone came to see, just a man who had been close enough to the end to no longer be interested in performing. "I don't wear this for fashion," Ford said quietly, thumb grazing the pendant. "It's the plane, the one I walked away from, barely." A pause. "It reminds me I didn't save myself." No one spoke. Even the hum of the stage equipment felt distant, as though the room itself had leaned back to give him space. And maybe that's when it happened, that shift, that realization. That moment when people stopped seeing Harrison Ford as the character, the myth, the meme, and started seeing him as the man who lay face down in the dirt and asked for nothing more than another chance to show up better. Whoopi finally found her voice, but it was lower now, cautious. "You're saying surviving didn't make you believe. It made you quiet." Ford nodded once, quiet enough to hear things I wasn't listening for before. The camera stayed on him longer than network rules usually allowed. No cue card, no commercial break, just stillness. No one interrupted. And in that moment, every person in that studio, and many more watching from screens across the world, felt something they hadn't come for. Not entertainment, not debate, but the unnerving, undeniable weight of truth spoken gently. Not everyone walked away from fire, but some, like Harrison Ford, came back carrying something silent and sacred. There was no cue, no transition music, just a soft flicker across the studio monitors, like static catching its breath. Then the main screen behind the stage lit up, not with graphics or promo, but with footage, grainy, unpolished, real. A helicopter hovered low over a dense stretch of forest. Snow still clung to the ground. The voice of a local ranger crackled through handheld radio audio. "He's coming in low. That's him. That's Harrison Ford." No one in the audience moved. Not a whisper, not even a cough. The footage showed the chopper touching down in a tight clearing between pine trees. A small figure, maybe 10 years old, was curled beside a fallen log. A man stepped out of the cockpit, moving with urgency but not panic. Flight suit, ball cap, no fanfare. He crouched beside the boy, checked his breathing, offered water. Then he carried him, arms wrapped gently around the kid's back to the helicopter. It wasn't a film set, it wasn't a stunt, it was Wyoming, last spring. The studio lights didn't dim, but they felt like they had. Something in the air thickened. Reverence, that's what it was. Not awe, not applause, reverence. Whoopi turned her head slowly toward the screen. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The clip continued in silence. Harrison in the cockpit. The boy buckled beside him. Then the aircraft rising again, blades cutting through stillness. Ford didn't react. He just watched it with the same still expression he wore when he landed the thing the first time. As if it wasn't remarkable. As if it was just what needed doing. Someone in the audience gasped softly. Another whispered, "He never said a word about this." The footage ended on a single still frame. The boy, now safe, wrapped in a blanket, giving a tired thumbs up to the camera. Behind him, Harrison stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes down. Back in the studio, the screen faded to black. A beat, then a whisper in the crew headset, barely audible but caught on a live feed. "We didn't cue that." "Who pushed it?" Another voice replied, "I thought it was you." A pause, then "We don't even have that in the rundown." On stage, Ford shifted slightly, only to tuck the pendant under his shirt. The moment didn't feel violated. It felt unplanned. And somehow more honest because of it. Whoopi looked over. her tone softer now, no longer layered with irony. That wasn't publicity. Ford shook his head. Never was. You just flew in. He nodded once. Kid was lost. Weather was dropping. They didn't have time to wait for the official guys. No heroics, no branding, just facts. The host stared at him for a long second, then turned back to the audience. They weren't clapping, but something in their posture had changed. Shoulders drawn in. Eyes fixed. No one was looking at their phones. Another whisper, off stage this time. One of the lighting crew, barely above a murmur. That was my nephew. No spotlight moved to find the speaker. No camera swung around. But the truth found its own path through the quiet. And in that space, between the screen fading and the silence stretching, an unspoken shift occurred, not just in the room, but in the story itself. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a reckoning, because some people show up with speeches, and some, like Harrison Ford, just show up. The quiet still hung in the studio like smoke after something sacred had burned through the room. The screen behind them had gone black again. No graphics, no promos, just the long, unplanned echo of something real. Whoopi sat straighter now. Her eyes didn't wander, they locked on him. Whatever thread of humor had carried her through the last segment had frayed. Her voice, when it came again, had an edge. You call that faith? Ford didn't answer, not right away. She pressed on. I call it something else, a kind of comfort story. Something people like to believe when the world stops making sense. Fairy tales, for grown men with old bones. There were a few small laughs, nervous ones, the kind that come when people don't know whose side they're supposed to be on. Harrison turned his head slightly. His face didn't change. He looked at her the way a veteran looks at a map, knowing some roads aren't worth taking. She leaned forward. Seriously, Harrison, you've flown through storms, crashed, been forgotten by a town that once printed your name on every marquee, and after all that, you still wear that little necklace and say there's meaning in it. He looked down at the pendant, touched it, then let it fall. I don't wear it to be saved. His voice was low, calm, steady. I wear it to remember what it feels like when everything breaks. And I believe because when that happens, panic is just another kind of silence, one that swallows you. Faith, at least, gives you a direction to walk in. The crowd didn't clap. No one dared to. It wasn't a punchline. It was a pulse. A few heads turned. A cameraman adjusted focus but didn't zoom in. The control room didn't cut away. Whoopi's lips parted, maybe to push back again, maybe not. But before she could speak, a voice rose from the far left side of the audience. It cracked the air like a match. He saved my mom. Heads turned. A woman stood up in the third row. No spotlight found her, but everyone saw. No cameras. No reporters, no story. She was hiking alone in the Snake River Range, twisted her ankle, no signal. We were sure she was gone, but a helicopter came in low. The pilot was him. She pointed at Ford. He didn't say his name. Didn't stay for thanks, just said, drink water, you're safe now, and flew off. Security moved quickly. One of them whispered something into a headset. Another approached the aisle, trying not to make a scene, but the damage was already done. Not the kind you erase with a cut to commercial, the kind that stays. The woman sat down slowly, hands shaking. Ford hadn't moved. Whoopi turned toward the crew. Did you know about that? The floor manager shook his head, slowly. Someone from backstage whispered, we have to reset. Go to break. No one moved. Ford exhaled, not loud, just enough to be heard in that kind of silence where everything else gets stripped away. He looked toward the woman, didn't nod. Didn't wave, just met her eyes with something still and human. Whoopi's hands curled around her chair, and for a flicker of a moment, the script, the control, the structure of it all wavered. The story was no longer hers, and she knew it. Whoopi's fingers gripped the cue cards like they might float away if she let go. Her eyes scanned them, then stopped. Her shoulders shifted, subtle, almost invisible to the cameras, but enough to betray what her voice would soon reveal. She blinked once, twice, then looked up at him. When I was 9, she said, her voice thinner than before, I used to pray every night. Not for toys, not even for friends. I prayed to be normal. The words hung like soft dust in the air, floating just long enough to sting before falling. I didn't know what that meant back then. I just knew I didn't feel right. In school, at home. I thought maybe if I prayed hard enough, something would shift, something would let me belong. No one moved, no one breathed wrong. I closed my eyes tight every night, said the same thing, please just make me enough, just the way I am. She laughed then, but it was hollow, a sound trying to hide in the shape of humor. Nothing happened, she said. I waited, waited for some kind of sign, a feeling, a moment, but silence came every time, and eventually I stopped asking. Ford hadn't moved. He watched her the way a man listens to thunder without looking up, because he already knows what storm sounds like. So I started mocking it, she continued. Faith, prayer, people who believed, I called it weakness. Fairy tales, I made it funny, because funny is easier than forgotten. She turned to face him fully now. Maybe I didn't laugh at your faith, Harrison. Maybe I laughed at mine, the one that didn't answer. The studio had never been this quiet. It wasn't the quiet of tension, it was something else, something deeper, a shared hush. The kind that settles into the cracks of everyone listening. Ford didn't speak. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't offer a neat quote or a clever line. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out something small. Worn, leather, faded along the edges, a notebook, no title, no branding. He turned it over once in his hands, thumb brushing the corners. Then he spoke, voice low, voice steady. I write coordinates in here. It wasn't a shift in topic. It was a response. Places I've landed, people I've found, people I wasn't sure I'd reach in time. He opened to a page, held it loosely. Sometimes when the weather's bad and the visibility's gone, you fly anyway. You don't know if you'll make it back, but someone's out there and they're waiting. Another pause. I never knew if someone was guiding me. I still don't. But I kept showing up. Not because I believed I'd succeed, but because I couldn't bear the idea of not trying. He closed the notebook gently, slipped it back into his pocket. That's what faith is to me. Whoopi didn't wipe her eyes. She didn't speak. She just stared at him like she'd never really looked at him before. And maybe she hadn't. Maybe none of them had. Because for the first time in that studio, Harrison Ford wasn't the guest. He wasn't the legend. He wasn't the story. He was the compass. And for a moment, everyone else was just trying to find true north. A faint click echoed through the studio, barely noticeable, just enough to feel like something shifted under the surface. Then a flicker, one of the overhead lights pulsed, almost like a blink. A low hum in the speakers warped for a second. Someone in the control booth muttered something, too quiet to catch. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The screens went black, the lights cut, the microphones died mid-breath. Silence, not the kind made by people, the kind made by something bigger. It wasn't darkness, not entirely. A dim emergency light near the floor flickered to life, casting a soft red glow that caught the edge of the stage. And in that glow, the only thing clearly visible was the chain around Harrison Ford's neck. The pendant, small, silver, shaped like an airplane, caught the red like an ember. He didn't move. No one did. Whoopi sat frozen, her hands still gripping the armrests. The audience didn't murmur, didn't shift, didn't even reach for their phones. They just watched. For 10 full seconds, time forgot to keep going. And in that stillness, something happened. Not a miracle, not a malfunction, something harder to name. The quiet wasn't empty. It was thick, full, like it had weight, like it had been waiting its turn. When the power snapped back on, it didn't come with a bang. No crash of music or sudden applause. Just lights humming, screens returning, the system finding its rhythm again. But the rhythm wasn't the same. Whoopi looked around slowly, blinking as if trying to remember where she was. The cue cards were still in her lap. The crew was moving again behind the cameras, but the room hadn't reset. Harrison hadn't moved at all, still seated, still calm, still grounded in whatever space he'd been in long before the lights had failed. Then a sound, a hiss of static. Low, unintended, from the wrong channel, but clear. It came through the booth speakers before anyone could mute it. A voice, crisp, confident, just keep pushing, go after the faith. If he breaks, it'll go viral. A pause. Then another voice, amused. He won't fight, that's the beauty of it. He'll sit there, and it'll eat him. The control room scrambled, the feed was cut, but it was too late. Several people had heard. A few had recorded. And in that moment, the real format broke. Not the tech, not the lights, but the trust. Because the audience understood what had happened. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a setup. They wanted a reaction, a collapse, a scene. But what they got, it was stillness. And that stillness refused to play by the rules. Ford finally moved, just his fingers, resting once more on the leather-bound notebook in his chest pocket. No speech, no defense, he didn't need one. The room wasn't interested in the show anymore. They were watching something else now, something rare, a man who refused to be provoked, and in a world built on noise, that silence hit like thunder. The clip of the blackout went viral within hours. It wasn't just shared, it was studied, paused, replayed, 10 seconds of silence during a live broadcast. No sound, no motion, just a red glow, a silver pendant, and a man who didn't flinch. People argued, was it a stunt? A technical failure? A power glitch? But none of that explained the feeling. None of that captured the weight everyone remembered in their chest. Theories spiraled. Hashtags exploded. Memes were made and discarded almost as quickly. But through it all, Harrison Ford said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no follow-ups, just stillness. Then 3 days later, he posted a photo, a wooden table, weathered, scratched from use. On it, a small silver airplane pendant resting beside a folded piece of paper. In faded ink, a single line, "Faith isn't about being heard. It's about who you are when no one's watching." There was no caption, no logo, no promotion, and yet it spread like fire because it didn't try to sell anything. It just was. In the comments, people didn't argue, they remembered. A nurse wrote, "I've sat beside dying patients who never said a word, but they held my hand like they meant it." That's what this felt like. A firefighter posted, "We call it command presence. When everything's burning and one voice says, 'We're gonna be okay,' even if they whisper it." A teenager wrote, "I don't believe in God. But after watching that, I believe in stillness." And then, quietly, unexpectedly, another video appeared. It wasn't a network release. It wasn't scheduled or produced. It was a live stream from Whoopi Goldberg, no makeup, no lights. Just her sitting in a quiet room, looking directly into the camera. Her voice was lower than usual, unrehearsed. "I've spent most of my life making people laugh," she said, "or think, or get mad. But that night, I just sat there. And something happened. I don't know what to call it. I just know I stopped talking long enough to hear something I hadn't heard in years." She paused. "Maybe I've never believed in anything. Not really. Maybe that was safer, easier." But watching him, not react, not defend, just be, something inside me cracked open. She didn't cry, but her voice broke just once when she said, "I think silence can hold truth." And that night, his did. Then she ended the stream. No farewell, no applause track. Just a woman who had spent a career asking questions, finally sitting with an answer she didn't expect. And maybe that was the point all along. Harrison Ford never raised his voice. But somehow the whole world heard him. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.